Welcome, everyone, to today's webcast titled Earning a Seat at the Table, the Necessity of Business Skills for Advancing In-House Legal Professionals. My name is Ramzi Salibi. I'm Associate General Counsel and Director of Legal Affairs for the Association of Corporate Counsel. I know that's a mouthful. Glad to be here today. Glad to be collaborating with King's Business School. And before we get started, I'll invite my co-panelists to introduce themselves. Crawford, would you like to go next?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Ramzi. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you happen to be. My name's Crawford Spence. I'm a professor of accounting at the Business School at King's College London. I'm also the Associate Dean in charge of executive education, where I head up our leadership programs and at the forefront of our partnership that we have with the ACC. You'll see there'll be a very soft plug later on for our mini MBA that we're running for in-house corporate counsel, which is part of the reason we're running this webinar today as well.
Great, thank you, Crawford. Chris, would you like to go next?
Thanks very much, Ramzi. My name's Chris Howard. I'm the Director of Professional Legal Education at Dickson Poon School of Law, King's College London. I head up a new initiative for the Dickson Poon School of Law called the Professional Law Institute. And it's been a pleasure to work with Ramzi and Crawford in beginning to build this program, which I think is going to be really, really valuable going forward. My background is as a solicitor in private practice. I was a construction lawyer at Trowers and Hamlins in the City of London before going on to embark on a career in teaching and education, in particularly professional legal education. So it's a real pleasure to be here and to share this experience with you today.
Great, thank you both. Wonderful. Well, before we get started on sort of some of the practicalities here, what I would like to do is just a brief overview of ACC's Chief Legal Officers Survey, and the goal here is to provide some data to help enrich our discussion. I also want to invite everyone, please feel free to ask any questions throughout. I'll ask the same of my panelists as I'm going through this data. Please do feel free to jump in and interrupt me. I'll try to not have this be too data specific and just throw numbers at you. We'll certainly try to unpack this information as well. So by way of background, our 2021 Chief Legal Officer Survey really goes out to chief legal officers who are the highest ranking legal officer within an organization, right? That could either be the general counsel, it could be sort of the chief legal officer role, just as long as they are the highest ranking legal officer. And we asked them a slew of questions, many of which are standard from year to year, and we do that to track trends, and then some are new. And for example, this year, as you can guess, we certainly asked about how COVID is impacting operations, and we'll get into some of those details as well. The real purpose of the CLO survey is to understand the role of the chief legal officer, and more specifically, how that role has evolved. And of course, even though I'm talking about the chief legal officer, this applies by extension to the whole legal department, and of course, all the practitioners within the legal department. And some of the really important themes that come out of the survey relate to that relationship between legal and the business, as well as how the business environment impacts the legal department. Another interesting theme that does come out of this data is sort of the future of the profession, and we're gonna do a little bit of that here as well. Look a little to the horizon and see what's coming for the profession as a whole. So with that, let's start off with some highlights here. First and foremost, and this is obviously very relevant to our discussion here, the chief legal officer is a key business partner. That's really should no longer come as a surprise to anyone, but this is a departure from sort of the perception of the legal department, say 20 or 25 years ago, right? That old perception being that lawyers, in-house practitioners should be working on purely sort of traditional legal work, and that is just no longer the case. Another interesting highlight is that many legal departments expect to add lawyers despite COVID-19 to their departments. Legal operations are now a strategic imperative. No surprise here, but data privacy concerns are always top of mind for organizations, and that's probably going to remain true for the foreseeable future. And then finally, environmental, social, governance factors, as well as diversity and inclusion issues, are taking center stage. And this is particularly true in the United States. And we had a sort of a short discussion about this point, and it seems at least the United States seems to be catching up, at least on the ESG issue in recent years. I understand it's probably a little more developed in the UK and Europe. So let's dig in on some of the takeaways from the survey as it relates to the pandemic. So first and foremost, again, no surprise, given that we are giving a Zoom webcast today, there's been an enhanced use of technology, right? A lot more video conferencing, a lot more e-signatures, a lot more document management software. And again, the takeaway there is that gone are the days where lawyers can say, well, I'm just not adept at technology anymore. That's just, that's long gone. In-house lawyers need to be investing in these sort of tech skills. Another takeaway relates to HR. A lot of people are working from home. That brings its own set of issues, including cybersecurity issues. Again, no surprise, but there's much less work related to travel. And it's a little unclear what the future looks like in that department. Interestingly enough, there's a lot more virtual court proceedings. And again, that's going to require an investment in technology, as well as sort of a lot of training and skills in being able to really be effective virtually during court proceedings. And then finally, social distancing challenges. Again, nothing new to everyone, but from an operational standpoint, if you can imagine you are a manufacturer or a large retailer, these social distancing requirements are a serious, operational and legal challenge. Okay, so next we're gonna talk a little bit about influence, and this really is probably one of the more important trends that we track, and that is what percentage of chief legal officers report directly to the CEO. This is absolutely a fundamental trend engaging the chief legal officer's influence. You can see in 2021 we've had about 78% have reported that they report directly into the CEO. And so what does that mean? What does that tell me? Well, that tells me that one, the CEO values the role of the chief legal officer and values the role so much that she's looking to the CLO for business advice, for legal advice, for governance matter, and perhaps as importantly, for just strategic decisions as a whole. A dip in this number would of course show the inverse of that. So we're pleased with this number. We think the trend is going to continue to increase. And I should note, apart from the CEO, the chief legal officer. So if you're not reporting into the CEO, you're most likely reporting into the CFO, the chief financial officer, and at a minimum, even if you are reporting to the CEO, you are working closely with the rest of the C-suite, and particularly the chief financial officer. So you can see where this is going. The legal department is increasingly being expected to work with the CFO, be comfortable, understanding, digesting the financials, and really just speaking the language of finance in order to be effective. And we'll get into that more. And if we do a little bit of a deeper dive here into some of the data, we can see some interesting trends. So let's take a look at, for example, I apologize, I know the image is a little small, so I'll call out some of the interesting points here. So how often does the executive leadership team seek your input on business decisions? And 70% said that they often do. And again, that's a pretty high percentage. So again, that role of sort of the legal department working on purely legal, purely traditional matters, that perception has been absolutely shattered. As you can see here, you will be required to give input on business decisions, and that's an absolutely critical point, and that's something you really need to start thinking about as you, one, get into the legal profession, and two, would like to advance your career within the legal, specifically the in-house profession. Some other interesting data points here: when your organization holds a board meeting, how often do you attend? That's nearly 80%. So 80% of the time, the chief legal officer is in the boardroom there. Okay. Let me see here. How frequently do you meet in executive sessions with the board or any of its committees? That seems to be a little lower, 45%, but it's still significant enough where you need to be ready for it. All right, let's move along here. Okay, I actually love this data point, and I really encourage you to take note of it. And the reason is we asked sort of CLOs, well, how are you spending your time? And again, I hate to belabor the point, but it is a very important one. Less than 30% said they spent. No, I'm sorry. Of the CLOs surveyed, they noted that they spend 30% of their time providing legal advice. Think of that. That's, it's actually 28%. That's less than a third of their time providing legal advice. Some of the other items they're doing, they're managing legal risk about 18% of the time, contributing to strategy development about 12%, advising executives on non-legal issues another 12%. So you have about a quarter of your time doing work that is, what I would think is traditionally a business role. Okay, so that's, really keep that in mind as we go through here. All right. So we've also asked chief legal officer, so what advice, and this is this is sort of a portion of the survey where it's free for the chief legal officer to directly write in, and I'll spare you some of the more comical answers we got. Something like, you need to have a bottle of ibuprofen or Advil near your desk at all times. So I'll just share with you the sort of the more serious ones here. And again, you'll see what's lacking is there's nothing about, well, you need to be better at negotiating commercial contracts. You need to have a better understanding of, global sanction regimes, right? Nothing like that on here. What is on here are knowing the business, right? You need to understand your business. Big part of that is becoming fluent in finance, right? It's becoming fluent when you're talking to the CFO, when you're presenting to the board and other executives. Develop management skills. Again, that's not something I learned in law school. That certainly wasn't a course that said, hey, develop management skills. Do the right thing. So of course, ethics is front of mind. Learn to manage risk. Again, that's not a purely legal sort of function. And then of course, embrace change, right? Be flexible, adaptive, agile, just important soft skills that in-house lawyers need to be honing. So I'll stop there. I'll see if the panel has any questions on that, or any comments on that, or if attendees have any questions. And again, please do ask questions. We're here to help. We're here to share our insight and just chat. So I'll pause there, see if anyone has any questions, and if not, I'll turn it over to Crawford.
And perhaps just worth pointing out, Ramsey, as a housekeeping point, that because these big webcasts we don't really have the opportunity to have people unmute themselves and ask questions. So please do use the Q&A function, which we are observing very closely, and we'll pick up any comments or questions that you have from there.
Yep, great point.
Ramsey, can I just come in and say that the previous slide that kind of apportioned the time spent on different types of matter within the law firm, within the organization rather, very much reflects the picture we're getting in the Professional Law Institute from the research we've done and from the talks we've hosted, that the bigger picture for lawyers of all shapes and sizes now is a very mixed palette of responsibility in terms of business leadership, in terms of management, and in terms of black letter legal advice. So I think that picture for in-house is reflected across the profession, but I think it's particularly stark and important for in-house and for chief legal officers, given their kind of crucial role for the business. But I think that goes to the changing nature of legal practice across the board.
Yeah, I do agree, and we're seeing, to add to that, we're seeing a lot of technology solutions that are aimed at freeing up time, right? Freeing up sort of the menial tasks that in-house lawyers have to do. For example, NDAs, those are pretty standard. Should a lawyer be spending, hours a week drafting NDAs? Probably not, especially when there are tech solutions that will automate that will do as good of a job. And the purpose of that is really not to sort of replace the in-house lawyer. No, it's to take that off their plate and allow them to do more strategic type of thinking, right? And so technology is also playing a big part of this and really enabling legal to become more of that strategic business partner. Looks like we do have a question in here from Brett. Says, I report to our CFO and have asked him in the past whether he thought it would be helpful for me to attend corporate financial type webinars, etc. His response was no. Any thoughts on how to work around that to still get the knowledge? What do you think, panel?
Well, this I think is interesting, and to be perfectly frank, in-house counsel are often in a double bind. And I've spoken to a lot of people who are a general counsel or GC -1, and they themselves are desperate to develop that broader business skill set. And quite often there have organizations that are supportive of that, but in at least half the cases, this is very anecdotal, that unfortunately there are still board members out there that want to pigeonhole people as the sort of legal experts and just want to use them for the legal advice purely. Now that I think, not to cast too many aspersions on your CFO, Brett, but I think that reflects badly on those particular board members, because that means that you're just going to be getting a limited input from your legal counsel. We don't want them just to be offering legal advice. They can do so much more strategically. How do you get around that? I suppose you just have to keep trying to make the case that you're committed to the organization. You don't just want to be providing legal advice. You have a more invested interest in how the organization develops strategically, but you can't really offer that unless you're tooled up yourself in terms of all these additional attributes that you think you need to accumulate.
Yeah, I think I just to chime in on that as well. I think there's a sort of cake and eat it mentality among some of these organization leadership, that they both want their in-house legal to be able to advise with a commercially minded sort of outlook, and yet at the same time want to kind of maintain control or draw up the drawbridge in terms of having that sort of overall responsibility and knowledge set around the corporate matters. But I think that, as you say, that can't persist, particularly if perhaps the way to sort of engage with that is if challenged to provide a commercial view on a decision, that's the point at which to sort of make that point that, well, these kind of strategic decisions, as they become more commonplace, will be better informed by a person with that sort of fuller skill set and fuller knowledge base.
All chief legal officers are seeing their role expanding, and just anecdotally I see that in titles, right? Every time I communicate with a chief legal officer, it seems like there's a competition for who has the longest title. And we have functions like IT are now reporting into the legal department. You have compliance reporting into the legal department, public affairs, government affairs, policy. It just seems like there's no end here. ESG now is falling within the purview increasingly of the chief legal officer. So I think you need to set boundaries from the start. I think you need to understand, how much legal spend do you have? So how much can you rely on your outside lawyers, on your external lawyers? How much resources in terms of technology can you leverage to help with your workload? And from a sort of practical standpoint, it's just communicating exactly what you just said. This is my concern, and of course that's going to be dependent on sort of the personalities at play here, but sort of vocalize that concern, and as Crawford says, maybe start agitating for some more resources. But great question.
Yeah, we've got another question there, Ramsey, asking specifically what skills should we be focusing on developing. And I think there's a whole raft of these, sort of leadership, broadly defined, strategy in itself, which is kind of a catch-all category, but equally, is a separate subject in its own right. If you can understand some of the sort of key strategic frameworks that are used in businesses these days, then that would be very helpful. Managing people, and that's not just managing downwards, that's also managing upwards. Very important, and indeed some of the questions we've been asked already is about how do you manage some of these relations upwards. And I think finance is important, circling back to Brett's question, and that's my sort of wheelhouse. So if I can give you a brief example of the type of stuff you need in finance to get on as any sort of business professional these days, and I think that's maybe illustrative. So, in finance, you don't need a huge amount, I find. You need a reasonable amount of finance knowledge in order to get you over a threshold. Most organizations have a whole panoply of KPIs that they rely upon, but really, not all KPIs are equal. And most sort of listed companies or private corporations, those that have a profit objective, they can be reduced to maybe just 4 or 5, return on equity, total shareholder return, maybe some sort of balance sheet ratios to do with gearing, capital structure, which measure how the organization is financed, and something to do with working capital. Obviously, there are a lot more beyond those, but if you, as in-house counsel, can link any decision that is being made through to those 4 or 5 ratios, then I think you're really speaking the language of the people on the board. Because remember, those are the metrics that they are being measured against on a regular basis, and often what they're being compensated on as well. So being able to make those connections between the advice you're giving or the decisions that anyone else around you are making, and those 4 or 5 different metrics, I think is a really useful thing to be able to do.
Yeah, I mean, if I can just jump in briefly as well, I'm just going to name check one of my colleagues, Michael Yeklik, who's our Director of Professional Skills within the law school, and who also teaches negotiation skills and strategic decision making as part of the bundle of skills and knowledge we're imparting to our students. And one of his sort of pearls of wisdom is that really there's a slice of knowledge and skills that if you can develop that slice, and I think Crawford's illustrated that very well in terms of the sort of KPIs and the business objectives of these kind of organizations, just with that chunk, that may be the piece that then allows you to speak with confidence and to be heard at the top table in a way that without that extra, just that sort of extra piece, you may find yourself still being treated as a slight disadvantage. So I think it's about just finding that core piece, and as I say, I think Crawford's illustrated that well, and then gaining that in order to then step forward.
Yeah, so Michael, speak of the devil, is this put a question in the Q&A there, Chris, asking, well, how much extra education does the in-house lawyer need in order to get to that next level? It's very hard to talk about this in quantitative terms, really, but if I can speak around the topic somewhat and hopefully answer this. In my experience in the last sort of 15 years has mostly been working on MBA programs. And what we try to do there, and I've done this in Canada and the UK, what we try to do there is not train people up to be experts in different domains. Typically an MBA program, you follow 12 different modules, something like that. And those, if it's done concentrated, could be 4-day modules on each topic. So by the end of that, you're not going to be an expert on marketing, but you can ask some serious questions of someone who's given you a marketing pitch and you know what language they're going to be speaking. Similar thing with finance. You're not going to be an expert in finance, but you can really ask some pressing questions of your CFO or your staff accountant in order to understand the implications of any particular decision or scenario is that you're being faced with. So I think in broad terms, what I would say is a little goes a long way. If you do a 3-day course, it's not going to absolutely transform your career, but it's going to get you over a certain threshold whereby you can start to have meaningful conversations with people who are experts in all of those other different business areas as well. And then you can build up from there going forward.
Yeah, I'd say it's going to be difficult to draw a bright line. You know, these issues of degree are kind of difficult to define. But I think I do agree with you, Crawford. I mean, doing nothing is not an option, right? So the minimum can't be zero. You're going to, fortunately or unfortunately, going to have to do something. And I've come across chief legal officers. I can think of one off the top of my head who worked for an agricultural business who actually went out and got a master's degree in agriculture. Okay, so that's how far that person went. And then I know folks who've done, no formal education whatsoever, not even a 3-day course. But what they did do was this was a grocer in Singapore. You know, he would sort of tag along with the delivery team. So he did that sort of to understand the business, right? He just tag along. He'd drive with them around on the, wake up early in the morning and do that. Some will sit in on sales calls. Some will, attend sales meeting to understand the business. So I don't think there's a bright line. But again, doing nothing, that's not an option. Chris, I believe I saw you unmuting yourself. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in on Bonnie Love's question there, or questions there as well, because I think it links into what you're saying and what we've been discussing here. I mean, MBA or LLM, it's a tough one in the sense that, obviously I'm going to say it depends, and classic lawyer answer. Look, LLM I think is still the gold standard in terms of advanced legal knowledge in specific practice areas, and picking up what Ramsey said there around, you need to look at the business needs of your organization, and if actually you're operating in a particular space that's around a particular legal discipline or disciplines, then obviously I think there's something not to be forgotten in this whole discussion, is that maintaining your expertise as a technical lawyer, I think, is essential. So of course LLM for many people is still
I think we lost Chris there.
Yeah.
Having said that, in terms of MBA, and I think this is where MBA is. Sorry, I'm breaking up a little bit. The MBA piece is the reason for the development of this program. The need, as has been pointed out several times, to develop sufficient business literacy and commercial literacy to be able to have those conversations, I think, is essential. And I think one of the advantages of a shorter program like this is that, given the A, state of resources for training, and B, how time poor many top in-house lawyers are, again, a program which can give you in a condensed package a really strong start into that language, I think is invaluable.
I think what I'll add there is that, look, no one's going to ask you. It is an interesting question that comes up. Should I do an MBA, LLM? And every time I ask this question, sort of on a panel or as I'm talking to chief legal officers, they almost unanimously say no. I mean, there's no formal requirement to get an MBA to get an LLM. That's really almost. I think the goal is to become, as Chris said, literate, right? In this with financial concepts, right? No one's going to walk into your office and say, "Oh, you have an MBA." That may help when you're applying for the job. It may help if people know, "Hey, I have an MBA or I have this training." But what's really going to go a long way, and what's really going to help you is the practicalities of it. Again, speaking the language, understanding it. That's what your colleagues are going to react to. So if you point out a mistake or have an idea on the balance sheet, your CFO is going to be impressed and probably not necessarily care whether you have a full-on MBA, whether you did you did the mini MBA. I think the sort of the practicalities will trump any sort of formal education that you take on. Having said that, of course, it's hard to get to that point without some kind of training. I'm just going to have to echo Chris's comment about it depends. All right, I think we have some more questions here.
Yeah, but they keep coming. We're going to offer some vignettes, but I mean, these are kind of good questions. I might struggle to answer Sergio's, to be honest. There's maybe someone else's views on that. There's an interesting question here from Anonymous, which is, they're the sole general counsel and an officer by resolutions of the company, but they can't get access to the weekly executive meetings or the quarterly board meetings. It seems like quite a small company, CEO's first time being CEO. Other executives do want them in the meeting, but the CEO is really the gatekeeper here and not budging and allowing the GC into the board meetings. This, what should they do? And this is an interesting case study. Ramsey, do you have data or stats on how many general counsels actually sit on the board?
So I have some data on how many regularly attend board meetings, and that's pretty high. It's in line with how many report to the CEO. How many sit? I don't have data on how many sit on the actual board itself, but anecdotally, it seems split. Whenever I talk to someone, they say, well, we don't want the general counsel on the board. And then sort of the other half say, no, it's a good perspective. So sorry.
Yeah. So that's a really difficult one to answer then. It sounds like, there's a captive audience in terms of the other board members, but the CEO, who's the ultimate decision maker, saying no. I'm not really sure what to suggest in terms of overcoming that. It sounds like it's very personality related. And it may be that there's just intransigence there and there's nothing that can be done about it. 9 months, okay, that's a long time. Will that change going forward? Possibly not. I mean, if it's not changed by now, it's possibly not going to change going forward.
Look, you can try to say, you're going to have to be very diplomatic, of course, but there's a way to make your case to say this is rather unusual, in the sense, again, that the vast majorities, and again, if you go to the CLO survey and download it, it's free, and take a look at some of the data, that you can maybe, again, diplomatically share that data with your CEO, and say, look, it's pretty common for the chief legal officer to at least attend board meetings. And yeah, I think the CEO suspects, look, as chief legal officer, your client is the organization, right? Not the CEO. And some CEOs, don't necessarily appreciate that fully. And that's always a very tricky line. And I think this is a very uncomfortable situation for you. I think it's problematic. And I'd be wary to give you specific advice just because sounds like it's very personality driven.
Yeah, I was just going to say, similarly, I think diplomacy has got to be all here. I know none of us would want to advise anything which is going to take you in a dangerous direction for your career prospects. But I think, perhaps another just very brief way of framing it is in terms of, as Ramsey said, your obligation to the organization. And perhaps if you could frame it that, in order to provide the kind of sound legal advice and strategic advice that the organization needs, you can't do that without sufficient access to all of the data that supports your decision making. And so if you see it as a business critical need to attend, and that will then affect the quality of the advice that you're able to give, perhaps that might be a way of framing it to demonstrate why that's an important need for the business.
I think. On you go, Ramsey.
No, go. I was just going to say, I think that's great advice. You could do it incrementally, right? Start off by saying, look, I just want to attend or present on very discrete areas, right? And just get a foothold into the boardroom. And if you can establish that foothold, you may be able to carve a place out for yourself.
Yeah, so we had some additional info and from Anonymous who's saying, actually the CEO is a great guy. He's just worried or anxious about everything since it's his first time. Well, maybe he's concerned about being shown up by someone who has, frankly, a lot more legal knowledge than he does. Perhaps there's a softer way to approach this in which, you make him feel like, you're there to support his agenda, and that you're an advocate for his strategy. And on the board, that's likely to come across as well. It's just important for you to do your job properly, that you hear what everyone else is doing and thinking, and that you can contribute by, to bolster the CEO's agenda. So try and assuage his anxieties somewhat by going down that route.
Good advice. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, Sergio. So Sergio's doing strategic and legal stuff. Does he deserve a big pay rise?
Let's see. Yeah, that's look, that's something else that we track at ACC. We're trying to figure out, at least within the US, but we're trying to do this globally as well. At least in the United States, publicly traded companies are required to sort of disclose their 5 highest paid executives, and so we're tracking, well, how many of those are the chief legal officer. I don't have that data offhand, but I think you're touching on a very important point here. Wait a minute, we just said that the role of the chief legal officer, the role of in-house counsel, is expanding. That means more responsibility. That means more liability, in a sense, right? You're in charge of different functions. Well, you're now liable for those functions. You're now responsible for those functions, and you would think that compensation would sort of increase proportionally with that increased responsibility. And I just don't have the data on that yet. Unfortunately, this again is going to be very personality driven. Personally, I do believe that in-house counsel should be paid more, but I'm in-house counsel myself, so take that with a grain of salt, right? I'm sorry, I don't know if I can give you, definitive advice on that. Although, well, sorry, just one last point on that. We do have a compensation survey. So where we're able to sort of, based on your role, the industry you're in, the size of your organization, the size of your legal department, at least give you a benchmark for what you should be getting paid. So that might be an interesting resource for you. Again, happy to chat offline if you think that'd be helpful.
Yeah, and Anonymous is asking, when's a good point to start with a mini MBA? I would think just whenever you feel like you're stagnating slightly, or that you have reached a plateau in your career and you want to have an extra boost. I think these courses in general, a lot of the knowledge you can gain by osmosis over a long time in an organization or working in different organizations. But what these things can do is just sort of fast track your learning and help you sort of take some shortcuts, really, some sort of legitimate shortcuts. So whenever you think you've up to speed on a particular job role, I think that's a good time to do that. And for some people, that may be not until you reach the GC position or the chief legal officer position. For others, it may be when you're much more junior, actually. So I think people at different areas may come in at different entry points, really, depending on their own career trajectories.
And I think that it's, sorry, just to jump in, Crawford, it's also got to be slightly dependent on the needs and scale of your organization as well. I mean, again, if the organization is of a size where you're being called upon at a fairly early stage, even in your in-house career, to make those kind of business calls, then obviously at that point you need to make sure you've got the or feel confident you have the training and understanding necessary to make those calls. Whereas if you're on a longer journey at a large organization, sort of stepping up towards that CLO position, it might be something that you take at a later stage. But yeah, it's very much dependent on the organization, I think, as well.
There's maybe one final question there that you could answer, Ramsey, and then maybe worth moving on to one or two of the vignettes to have a discussion or an analysis of those. Again, from Sergio, I don't know if you answered this before, that in-house counsel, do they earn more than other C-suite salaries? I would have thought no, but I don't know the answer to that.
I don't. I would hate to give. I would hate to speculate on that. I really have to look at the data. But again, if you just drop me a line offline, I will. Drop me a line offline. I'll try to get that information for you. My sense is, I agree with Crawford. I don't necessarily think so, but at least for the Fortune 100, so the largest companies in the U.S., they're at least in the top 5. Obviously, not more than the CEO, but they may be somewhere in the middle. All right, I think we have another question here. I report to the CFO, but when I was hired, they were going back and forth between CFO and CEO. Not involved as much as I want with executives. CFO is really great and would advocate for me if ever needed, but I always actually work with CEO on final approval of outside scope of things. Should I ask to change to report to CEO? So I've met with chief legal officers who've refused to take a chief legal officer role unless they reported directly to the CEO. That's certainly a sort of risky thing to do, right? I mean, this is certainly your career, but a lot of chief legal officers feel strongly about it. But yeah, look, my answer to you is proceed with caution. Be very diplomatic. This is going to be personality driven. Small incremental steps, I think, will make some sense. We have the data, as you can see, to support you reporting to the CEO, so that may be helpful. Um, if I can ask, where are you located geographically? Because it's also a very region intensive question. In Florida. Okay, so yeah, in the U.S., it's just much more common than, say, for example, in Japan, for the chief legal officer to report to the CEO. As you know, your reporting structure is rather outside of the norm, at least for the U.S.
I think it's important to make distinctions here between formal and informal rules. On paper, it might look better, you might feel better if you're reporting to the CEO, but that, as Ramsey alludes to, might be a problematic transition to enact politically. And in any case, what you might find is that informally the relationships continue just as they did before in any case. So it's maybe worth recognizing that informal reality. In spite of what things look like on paper or the organogram, there's always a more complicated reality underneath, and those things are harder to shift in spite of having different reporting lines, etc., etc.
Good point. Yeah.
But Ramsey, maybe just we won't have time to go through all the vignettes, but if you want to flick forward to maybe the Uber one, which I think is an interesting one that we can maybe have a brief discussion about before we wrap this up. Someone's laughing about the notion of an organogram. Yeah, okay, so I had actually 3 different vignettes here for you. And this is an interesting legal case that was passed just in the last couple of weeks, I think. Chris, you'll be able to correct me if I'm wrong about this. And this has been an ongoing issue in lots of different countries with Uber, whether those who are driving for Uber are employees or are they self-employed. I don't know what the current view is on the US on this, but the UK Supreme Court ruled, that was last month, that Uber drivers are now to be considered employees. This has been a long, ongoing court battle with the App Drivers and Couriers Union, which I didn't know existed until I read this article. Because Uber, obviously, it's easier for them to just put themselves out there as a tech company, or what they like to describe themselves as a booking service. And of course, as a booking service, you don't have to pay service tax, what we call value-added tax in the UK, on fares, or pay drivers when they're waiting for rides, on their downtime. You also don't have to worry about things like sick pay, holiday pay, pension contributions, any of that other stuff. And indeed, there's a separate dispute ongoing with Uber, with the Revenues and Customs Agency in the UK over their tax liability in this respect. But anyway, this judgment has now ruled that Uber drivers must be considered employees. And this is where me, as the Uber chief executive, if you like, it's a federated structure, so I'm the regional managing director, maybe of the UK or Europe. I want to think about how I'm going to respond to this, and I need some legal advice on it. So the judgment considered 4 major aspects, one of which Uber themselves set the fare, which means that they dictated how much drivers could earn, which is an indication of an employment relationship. Uber also sets the contract terms, and drivers had no say in them. Again, an indication that they're employing someone rather than negotiating over contracts. The request for rides is also constrained significantly by Uber, who can penalise drivers if they decide to reject rides that are too far away. Again, something that ruled in favour of those arguing that Uber drivers were employees. And finally, Uber can monitor the driver's service record through their star rating, which is effectively like performance reviews. So, and has a capacity to terminate the relationship if, after repeated warnings, this does not improve. So, I am the managing director of Uber in the UK, let's say, or you can imagine that this same ruling has taken place in the US, and I want some advice about what I do next. Now, Uber, we know their general approach to things. They are likely to resist this in all sorts of different ways. So you can take the view that we should resist this. We could look at the four elements of that judgment and tweak our organizational model such that we come down on the other side of those, or we can seek to comply with it. Or what? I mean, there are legal aspects here, but there are strategic aspects as well. There are obviously the public relations issues that we need to think about. And consumers, we know, are in something of a double bind here. They enjoy the ease of access that you get from Uber, but there's a slightly guilty feeling knowing that the person who's driving you tends to have a pretty crummy deal of it. And there's been the sort of knock-on effect on other, more institutionalized taxi services as well. So, yeah, do we have any advice from the audience as to what we should do here as an organization? Maybe while we're waiting for anything to come in, maybe I don't know if Chris or Ramsey have any views on this. Ramsey, maybe you could apprise us briefly and quickly of what the current situation is with Uber in the US. Do you know?
In California, I believe they passed some kind of law. I'm sure folks in the audience would know better than I would. They passed a law saying that Uber drivers are employees, but that was eventually overturned. So at least in the United States, and in each state is kind of approaching this a little differently, but for the most part, Uber drivers are still considered contractors, meaning, as you say, they wouldn't be entitled to the benefits of regular employment. But this is cropping up all over the world, and it's certainly top of mind for Uber. I know that their chief legal officer Tony West is, I think neck up in dealing with this issue, and I think you've hit it on the head, right? This is not a purely legal issue. There's a lot to juggle here, and the public relations, the communications aspect of it is going to be massive.
Yeah, I mean, can I just jump in there and say, classically, I'm not going to express a view on the outcome of the problem, as it were, but I think this is a really good example of why CLOs need to be, and in-house lawyers need to be equipped to engage with this kind of decision, because I think it brings together issues around ethics, around regulation, around business strategy, and around management strategy. All of the, it's a combination problem. It's a wicked problem, or whatever term you want to use. It's got all of those different features, and I think this is where the traditional single track legal mindset is insufficient to assist with a call like this. I think that's why preparing yourself for a multifaceted business decision and to advise on a situation like this is absolutely essential. So it's a really good example.
And if you take a step back, you have to start thinking, well, look, if the legal department needs to be looking at this globally and saying, well, are we going to see similar judgments all over the world? And if so, how can we get ahead of it? And if it looks like there's going to be, at least in sort of these larger cities, larger jurisdictions, a requirement that Uber drivers be treated as employees, well, why don't we get ahead of the issue and just mandate that, globally, and that way we look really good. It might hurt a little bit at the outset, and I think that's, Crawford, feel free to jump in, but I think that's where you need to understand your business, right? That's where you need to start understanding, well, the decisions that you make are not purely just legal, they're not purely just financial, but there's a huge ethical and public perception component as well, and sort of quantifying that is no easy feat.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And you have a parallel situation going on just now, and across another gig economy type of organization, Deliveroo, who are going to be they're enacting an IPO, an initial public offering, as we speak, and this is going to be the UK's biggest IPO in the last 10 years. And I was speaking to a fund manager about this yesterday, and they were saying that there's a wildly ambitious share price that has been set for Deliveroo with their investment banker friends, Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, and it's possibly not going to reach that level. They're worried because there are a lot of negative perceptions around Deliveroo, as there are around organizations like Uber, around workers' rights and how people are being treated. And with the rise of ESG criteria coming into a lot of fund management, that becomes a serious issue that's going to impact shareholder returns as well. So we will see over the next few days how this IPO goes and actually what share price target they actually end up getting. It's likely to be less than 460. The minimum they thought they were going to sell was £3.90, but you never know with these things. But that's one way in which the market will speak in order to let the Deliveroo management know whether or not that's a big issue for them.
And again, Ramsey, you mentioned technology earlier, just very briefly. I mean, obviously, the management of legal technology is a new facet of the role of the in-house lawyer, but so is the appreciation and understanding of this continual organic development of technology-based business and how to then advise on areas where the law may not yet exist, and therefore it's a much more of a risk management decision rather than necessarily a legal decision about how things are going to play out.
Yep. Yeah, it's sorry, go ahead, Crawford.
No, I was just going to say, well, we've got one final question on legal professional privilege from Jeff, which is a nice one. But equally, people have started dropping off soon. I don't know if we need to wrap up.
Sure. Again, I'll offer, we have a whole advocacy team at ACC. So Jeff, again, I think I've made this offer a few times. Feel free to drop me a line. I'm happy to talk that through with you as well. We have a lot of resources on that.
I just wanted to jump in and do a quick plug for some resources that you'll find on the King's website. So if you Google Future of Legal Practice at King's, we have a series that the Professional Law Institute have developed of short talks on a whole range of issues around the future of legal practice, including the rise of in-house legal practice. So do Google Future of Legal Practice at King's.
Yeah, and finally, we have been softly plugging this as we've gone through, but we've been talking about this course in roundabout terms, but we are offering this mini MBA for in-house lawyers at King's College London. It's obviously been delivered virtually for this particular iteration. Starts on the 11th of May this year over a series of different sessions, 6 live sessions, some guided self-study as well, cover a whole range of different topics from finance through to leadership, corporate governance, strategy, and a couple of others as well. And we're partnering with ACC in order to deliver that course. So you can find more information about that here. I'm obviously happy to take any questions you may have on that now or offline as well.
Wonderful. Don't know if we have time. We have 1 more minute left. Maybe we can get one question in, but it doesn't look like we have anything. Wonderful. Well, look, I this was really fun. I really enjoyed it. I want to thank everyone for their questions. That's always love to be on a webcast where the audience is engaged. But again, thank you, Crawford. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, King's Business School. This was really fun.
Thanks a lot for hosting, Ramsey. That was great.
Yes, thank you, Ramsey, and thanks to the ACC and to the King's Business School too. Good to see you.
Yeah, and have a great day, everyone, whatever's left of it.
That's right. Bye, everyone.